The story of Abraham taking Isaac to be sacrificed brings cries of horror, child abuse, and paganism. It begs a question about the nature of God and what kind of father Abraham was. The compiler of Genesis places this highly polished story before us without any interpretation. It's a very carefully constructed story. The German older Testament scholar Gerhard von Rath says the expositor, the preacher, the explainer, is much more accurate when he discovers in the narrative above all the idea of radical test of obedience. But he goes on to warn against simply reducing this story to a test of Abraham's faith. It is a story, he says, that's about God, Isaac, and Abraham. All three are significant players. I would also add the warning that we must be careful to read the story through the lens of our culture, our Western culture, and the way we value family today. But let's look at the story for a moment, and in the first place it reminds us that God is free to give and to take away. God is absolute sovereign. As Job says of God, he snatches away, who can stop him? Who will say to him, what are you doing? The absolute sovereignty of God is foundational to our faith and other faiths as well as that for that matter. Secondly, the boy Isaac is no mere foil to the test of Abraham's faith. Isaac is the gift of God, the child of promise. In Isaac, God has invested the salvation of all people. The point is this: Isaac is not just a natural gift of a child born to a family, but Isaac represents God's promise of blessing, and it's to a couple who, to all intents and purposes, were barren. To take Isaac out of the equation, so to speak, is to negate God's promised blessing. So this whole story cannot be reduced to an ancient story against child sacrifice. It's much more than that. It's a radical test of faith concerning the promise of God and pointing out the essential thing that God has given Abraham and Sarah a child and given the nation of Israel and the following faiths, the gift of faith. Thirdly, it is a test of Abraham's faith. It's not the first test that Abraham faced. There are many instances where Abraham's faith had been tested. He was called, he and Sarah were called to leave their home and go into a land, didn't know where exactly he was going. And after a while, a famine struck the land, and he took what many of us do. He went by his own reason and decided to go to Egypt, the bread basket of the world then. It would have not been unreasonable for Abraham to say, well, what's God doing? He sends me off and now I'm in a famine. Abraham uses the wisdom of the world and he goes to Egypt. There he runs into trouble. Pharaoh wants his wife. Abraham says she's his sister, and so they get caught up with Sarah being a concubine to Pharaoh. God rescues Abraham and Sarah later, and they return intact to Canaan. Time passes by and they are still childless. They take matters into their own hand, and we have the story of Hagar and Ishmael. Then there's the strange visit of 3 men, and the promise of a child is renewed. It seems unbelievable. They must have struggled enormously with the promises of God. We are already then picking up the pattern that in every action of living there's a potential test of our faith. Similar tests confront us. How will we practice our faith in the family, the commercial and sporting arenas of life? We Westerners tend to compartmentalize our lives and relativize our faith in certain situations. So Abraham's story is very pertinent to us. What does it say to us today? It acts as a profound reminder that God's gifts are God's to give and to take. That God's gifts are to give and to take. They are not rewards for what we have earned. This radical experience would have made Abraham acutely aware that the most precious gift he had, his son, was entirely God's gift to him. This story reminded Israel that they were a nation formed out of the gift of God. Their nationhood could not be traced to legal titles or tradition or achievements, but as a pure gift from God. And this story reminds us that our faith is a gift too, and Paul encapsulated that in Ephesians. For by grace you have been saved through faith. This is not of your own doing. It is a gift of God. Our conversations in church circles are careless. They are often very careless. We use the possessive pronoun to describe our relationship with the church. I recall a small ecumenical gathering just up Toorak Road down there towards the eastern suburbs. I spoke about my church. Then I quickly corrected myself and said, the church I served. And some laughed gently when I said it. It's not my church, I minister there. It is so easy to speak of the church we meet with as my church. But does not this casual way of talking often lead us down a pathway where we think the church belongs to me? It's my church. My friends, in my ministry, I've encountered people being very possessive about their church and becoming quite obstructive in any discussion about change. Our faith is God's gift to us. This experience of Abraham would have been a deep journey into God-forsakenness. Can you imagine Abraham taking his son and his servant and they're going along? What he must have experienced? I don't think we can really do that, but we can begin. How strange and alone Abraham would have felt as he journeyed with Isaac to the mountain of God. How bewildered he must have felt about God. There would have been no joy in his journey. This story we read today is about the profound journey into a deeper relationship with God. And the profound journey into a deeper relationship with God always encompasses a measure of darkness, heaviness. Abraham is being asked to give his all to God because Abraham's future lay in Isaac. On the journey, Isaac asks his father, where's the sacrificial lamb? Children always ask difficult questions, don't they? And Abraham replies, God will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And the story ends in verse 19 and says, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Now, when you look at that Hebrew term that we've interpreted as provide, there's another meaning. It can mean see. We could read this in this way, that on the mount of God, on the mount God shall be seen. And here I see a spiritual truth, that the closer we get to God, we see more clearly and see God's provision. This story reminded the ancient Hebrews that their identity as a nation was entirely God's gift. And likewise, it should remind us this morning that our gift of Christianity, the faith, the church that we belong to, is God's gift entirely. Today it reminds us that our faith and experience of God is not due to our discovering God so much as God discovering us and gifting us with life. Let me, in closing, share a story. It's an experience I had. I, in fact, have never shared this experience publicly because I feel it's kind of childish, kind of immature, silly. I was close to 20 years of age. I had responded to the call to ministry, and I was learning to be a lay preacher in the Methodist Church in South Africa. A group of lay preachers invited me into their fellowship, and one of them was my mentor, a great mentor. We had spent a weekend together where we were seeking a closeness with God. It was the kind of stuff we sing about. Search me, O God, or as the deer pants for water, so my soul longs for after you. But that weekend, we were doing that. That Sunday afternoon, in the last and final session, I renewed my pledge to follow God and give all. Then I heard a voice say, "Peter, go and sell your motorcycle." Now, my motorcycle was the only means of transport I had, and I loved my Velocet 350cc motorcycle. I left terribly disturbed. Strangely enough, the week before, the petrol pump attendant had offered to buy my bike. I said it wasn't for sale. So, struggling with this new thought, I said to God, I will offer my motorcycle to that man. If he wanted it, I would sell it. Instead of feeling elated after that weekend, I felt deflated and uncertain. I went to the petrol station that Monday after work, and the attendant was there, and I offered the motorcycle, and he said he didn't want it. Of course, I was relieved. Now, some of you may see holes in this story. You may see the immaturity of an older teenager, and whether God actually would ask me to sell something that was basically my only form of transport, and I needed it. It was essential to my work. But what that experience taught me was so significant. It is the one thing to say to God, it is one thing to say God was testing my faith, but I learned that in being willing to give up something so important to me, that I could do that. I learned that I could give up something so important and give it to God. And I learned the first real step in saying to God, "You first, Lord." And I learned something of the potential cost of serving God. My life was not fully mine anymore. I learned I could go further with God, put God first, and that was a blessing. What may seem a silly story to you was a key building block in my walk with God. And yes, I have made some big commitments in my time and given up things I would love to have had. But that lesson was a great gift. Now let me add, I've not always found it easy to surrender to the will of God, let alone understand it. It has been a big struggle to put God first in my life. But I do know something of the potential in letting go and letting God in to one's life. And I thank God for that.